Please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Carl Marci, Executive Vice President and Chief Neuroscientist at Nielson Consumer Neuroscience.
So what a day so far. We've heard some incredible presentations with some great case studies. And I believe it was Monty Python that said, okay, now it's time for something totally different. So what is consumer neuroscience? Well, consumer neuroscience is the application of neuroscience principles, usually taken from healthcare and academic work, and applied to media and marketing questions. And I often start a talk like this by asking a rhetorical question, which is, why is a Harvard-trained neuropsychiatrist standing on a stage in front of a bunch of media and marketing experts? Well, the reason is the world has changed. And if you haven't noticed, there's an awful lot more screens, there's an awful lot more networks, an awful lot more content that is vying for the hearts and minds of our consumers and audiences. And in order to capture and win a share of those hearts and minds, we have to use more and better tools. And one of the things that Nielson has recognized is that you have to both do that on a conscious level, meaning talking to our targets, but also on a non-conscious level. So in order to really understand this new environment, which is changing so rapidly, we feel very strongly that you have to understand this. And what is this? The human brain, 100 billion neurons, each one making between 10 and 20,000 connections. It's thought to be the most complex entity in the known universe. And you know what's really cool? We all have one. And I make very few guarantees in life, but I guarantee the brain you walked in with this morning is not the brain you're going to go home with. Why? Because throughout the day, as you learn and are engaged, your brain is filtering information and emotions are tagging it for relevance. So we've been here all afternoon talking about engagement, and the word emotion comes up every now and then, but we haven't defined it. And so part of my job is to define engagement. So think of engagement as attention to something that emotionally moves you, and the outcome of that is to lay down a memory trace and prepare us for future action. Now, the beginning part of that definition, attention to something that emotionally moves you, is where I want to focus. And I think we all have an intuitive sense for what attention is, right? We're sort of moving our attentional vector around. Hopefully some of your attention is up here as I speak. I know there's competition with your smartphone and other things in your busy lives. But we pay attention to an awful lot of things that don't leave a mark on us. It's that second component, emotion, that really matters. So I want to spend a moment and define emotion. So don't think of emotions as simple feeling states. I'm happy, I'm sad. Think of emotion as a process, and it's a process that's always on. Our emotion system has evolved to tag information for relevance. We are surrounded by information all the time. How do we know what's more important or what's less important? That's what our emotion system does. And the output of that process is one of four things, right? You saw an example of there a moment ago, right? I'm happy. I just used the word happy. Language is one way we communicate emotion. I also smiled a little bit. Nonverbal communication or signals are another way we communicate. But then there are two others that people often don't think about. One is that we lay down a memory trace, and the second one is that we actually act. And that combination of things is really, really important. And the other important fact about the human brain is that this thing we think of as consciousness, right, the ultimate screen is the one in our own minds, is only a small fraction of what the brain is doing at any given time. And so in order to really understand our audiences and our consumers today, we have to go a little bit deeper, and we have to learn more about what's going on. And so what I want to do today is sort of walk through some data and give you a sense for how this world is changing and some thoughts about how to manage it. So this is a slide from Nielson. You know, there's this growing sense. We talk to clients every day, and we hear, oh, you know, people are watching less and less TV. Well, when you actually look at the data, it turns out that's not so true. In fact, what's true is that people are actually just consuming more video. Why and how? It's because of mobile devices. And it's also because of simultaneous usage. So this is just looking from 2002 up to 2015 at a range of different media devices at the weekly time spent based on the total US population. And what you see is that orange live TV is actually fairly constant. What's changed are the proliferation of new devices and the ability to connect with content outside of the home and as we are on the go. Now, one of the things that, of course, people are worried about and where you see the trend is in age. And this is now looking at a population with different ages, and the ages are down below. And as a father of 3 who are under 3 years old, that first bar worries me a little bit. But there's a shift, and there's a very clear shift going on. And that is a world in which children are born where there are devices all around them, and they're able to use them so quickly. I have this video of my now 3-year-old when he was 1 year old swiping an iPhone with ease. The interface is so intuitive, a 1-year-old can do it. And imagine him as he grows up in a world. Changes, the mix of devices that people are using to engage with media are also shifting. And I thought it would be sort of relevant, given that Time Inc. is the sponsor, to talk about a study we did with Time Inc. back when they were a division of Time Warner. Betsy Frank, the chief research officer at the time, said, Dr. Marci, I really want to understand the difference between digital natives and digital immigrants. And candidly, I said, Betsy, what is a digital immigrant? What is a digital native? And she explained to me, this was a few years ago, she said, well, you know, the digital natives are the young people who are born into a world that only know a digital world. And the immigrants, like me and her at the time, are those who came into a world. We were born when there were only a few channels, and now everything has proliferated. Is there a difference not only in the way they consume media, but in their emotional responses to how they consume media? And I said, you know, that's a really interesting question. And we did this study. We actually biometrically monitored people in the home. And we had 2 groups, basically so-called digital natives or millennials and so-called digital immigrants, Gen X and baby boomers. And we followed them throughout the day. From the morning, they took the devices off during their workday, in the evening, and then part of the weekend. And we looked at all this data, and we also had cameras on their heads, so we could see everything they were doing. And we coded every second of that experience. And one of the things that got the headlines was this, and it's this shift in attention. And what we're looking at here is the number of times when there was 2 or more platforms that were visible in the camera that the user or the participant shifted from one to the other. And what you can see is that the immigrants were actually shifting quite a lot, 17 times per hour. The natives go up a whopping 60% to 27. And what does that translate into? That translates into about a 30% decrease in their attention span. And what does that look like? Well, one of the things that it alters is the emotional experience of content. So I'm going to put up a slide here, and I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. What you're looking at here is the emotional response throughout about a 2-hour period for a single digital immigrant. We're going to call him Isaac. And this is in the evening, and the color code shows the different platforms that Isaac is engaging with. And so what you can see is that he's watching TV alone for a little while, but then there's this brown period where he's got TV and a newspaper, and he's going back and forth with the TV. And then you can see there's this spike in his emotional response where he puts that newspaper down and he watches TV for a while. And then he switches to a magazine as it kind of trails off and eventually goes to bed. Now let's contrast Isaac, our digital immigrant, with Nate, our digital native. 3 things should pop out. First, the colors change. So now Nate is watching TV, but he's also got a smartphone or a tablet that he's going back and forth with, number 1. Number 2, you can see the number of striations. We call this an interference pattern, is actually much more frequent in Nate than it is in immigrant. He's going back and forth more often. That's that 60% change in switching I showed you a minute ago. And then number 3, importantly, is his emotional response is different, right? It's higher, but it's also flatter. And one of the things we see as people use more and more multi-platforms and do more and more multitasking and switching is that while their emotional responses aren't as low, the payoff isn't as high. People are using media as a mood regulator. The digital natives and my son and generations along with him do not suffer boredom well because they do not have to. They're always one screen away from some titillating emotional experience. And it's just too tempting not to do that. And so what you have is this sort of this plateau in the emotional response, and that means the bar for engaging them is even higher. Now what you can see is there are moments where he does spike. And what we see in our data is that you can engage these so-called digital natives. And by the way, if you take heavy users of media and lots of different platforms and people who are multitaskers, of any age, they start to also look like this. And so it's a function of use as much as it is age. But again, this just raises the bar even more. So to break through this, you've really got to understand how to engage. OK, shifting gears, different study here. The question arose a couple of years ago, which is, OK, you guys are pretty smart. You got all this neuroscience stuff. Can you tell us how people engage with different size screens? Same content, different size screens, or even different content. I was like, that's an interesting question. And we had a hypothesis, right? We're good scientists. And our hypothesis was bigger is better. The bigger the screen is, the more emotionally engaged people will be. Turns out we were wrong. And we've done this study now multiple times. I'm going to show you one example. This is an in-lab study now. We're not in the home. People are wearing biometric devices. We've got eye tracking. And they're given simple instructions. Here's a TV. You have an hour. Watch the way you would at home. You do whatever you like. And that's the data with the TV screen there. And then the one next to it is same instructions, except now you have video on demand. Pick whatever content you want. Can't go to cable, but you can watch whatever you want. You can switch programs, do whatever. And what you're looking at is the emotional engagement just to the advertising. And what you can see is there's a little bit of a bump up, right, in the video on demand. Lower ad load, more commitment to the programming, a little higher engagement overall, but not significantly different. We then brought people in and gave them the same instruction, except now you have a PC, or now you have a tablet, or now you have a smartphone. And again, we're looking at just the advertising, and we expected to see a step function. And you can see there's a little bit of a decrease here, but there's an awful lot of overlap. And again, we've seen this over and over and over again. So what I now say is that people actually engage with the platform they're engaging with. They adjust the screen to the distance of their eyes, put earbuds in, tune other things out, and you can actually get quite emotionally involved regardless of the screen side. OK, so that's important. We need to understand that. But is it the whole story? Now I'm going to switch to a different metric, same study, and we're going to look at the probability of getting through a 30-second ad in its entirety. So we're going to start with those first two groups, right? Big TV, video on demand, big screen, and we see that the probability of getting through an ad in its entirety is 84% and 83%, respectively. When you then switch to the other platforms, tablet, PC, and smartphone, that drops dramatically. A little bit of a bump up with smartphone. There's less skipping options there, but you see a huge decrease. OK, well, this seems relevant to advertisers. Can we go a little bit deeper? And here we're going to look at now not just advertising levels of emotional engagement, and not just advertising how far do they get through it. Let's just focus on that branding moment, right? Part of the whole point of advertising is not just to engage, but to attach it to your brand, product, or service. And we know that most of the branding occurs at the end. Well, what I'm going to show you here is some eye tracking data where we're actually measuring within a fraction of a centimeter exactly where people are looking on a screen. We're honing in on the branding moment. The first metric is simply the number of seconds the eyes are in fixation. A fixation is 50 milliseconds. It's a minimum amount of time the brain needs to process information. How much time in fixation during the brand on the screen across these platforms. And what you see is about a 20% decrease. OK, not that big. Now we're going to hone in a little further, and we're going to hone in on the logo and the tagline. And what you see is now that step function starts to appear. And by the time you get to a small screen, you've got almost a 50% decrease in the amount of fixation on the brand or the tagline. And that is significant. And I want to show you an example of what that looks like. And hopefully this will play. What you're going to see here is an eye tracking video. So this is an ad, happens to be from Acura. We're not picking on Acura. They just happen to demonstrate this point very well. You're going to see during this ad some black screens and some copy going across. Watch the eye tracking and see if you can follow a pattern.
The all-new TLX from Acura.
Okay, so that ad played amongst a whole lot of other stuff on a full screen TV as people were watching it. Now I'm going to show you the exact same ad on a smartphone and see if you can notice a difference in the pattern.
The all-new TLX from Acura.
So what did you notice? They're kind of zoning out. And what's amazing is it took about $1 million of research to get to this example to teach a very simple lesson. As the screen gets smaller, you can't use the same ratio of brand and copy information as you do on a big screen. And so that simple lesson is just one of many that we're learning as people look like they're very similar as they engage across these different screens. But when you dig in a little bit deeper, some nuances and some subtleties appear. So one of the ways we approach this is we have this suite of tools. I won't bore you with the details, but we try to use the right job for the right tool for the job. And as we go forward and think about how we define engagement, we want to get closer and closer to consumers as we can. And I want to end with one last case study. This is a study we did on the Super Bowl. And there's no bigger platform for advertising than the NFL's big game. And I like to say there's always two games going on Super Bowl Sunday. One is on the field for a trophy. The other is in between plays during the advertising for the hearts and minds of the viewers and the consumers. And it's become a really big deal. On average, over 100 million viewers, minimum $4 million for a 30-second spot. It's a huge investment. And for every year, for 8 years, we did a big Super Bowl study. We would recruit people in, bring a friend. We would serve beer and pizza, 1 beer per quarter. That wasn't the goal of the study. And then we would put biometric devices on them, sometimes eye tracking, sometimes some other things, and we would measure their engagement, and then we would rank the ads. And one year we had this idea, we wanted to go even deeper. We wanted to understand what was actually happening in the structures of their brain. So we partnered with a group at Temple University. Temple University is very unique. In the business school, they have an fMRI machine, just to give you a sense of where things are going. So it's not used for healthcare. It's not used for any research. It is used for marketing and media research. And so we took the top ads from that year based on our emotional metric, the top 10. We took the bottom 10, and then we took 10 in the middle, and we randomized the order and presented to people literally lying in an fMRI machine. And when you do this kind of research, you do what's called a subtraction technique, and you're looking for what's called residual brain activity. And what that means is just where are the areas of activity that differentiate the really engaging ads from the really not so engaging ads. And we were really excited because we saw activity in the hippocampus, the amygdala, superior temporal gyrus, and the lateral prefrontal cortex. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and venture to guess that doesn't mean a whole lot to you. But what if I were to tell you we saw activities in areas of the brain related to memory formation, emotion generation, the integration of sight and sound, and reward evaluation? Oh, now all of a sudden that starts to make sense. And it starts to make sense because this becomes a brain definition of engagement. But that's not the whole story. There was one other piece, and this, while we kind of hoped for and expected some of this last piece we didn't expect. And I'm going to show you this slide here. This is an area of the brain. The front is on the right, the back is on the left. See that big white spot in the back of the brain? That's called the precuneus. The precuneus is an up-and-coming part of the brain. And it's thought to be related to our personal identity, our sense of self, and things that are relevant. And so now the story evolves a little bit. And that story is not only do you have to grab their attention, you have to generate an emotional response, you have to trigger the reward centers, you have to integrate sight and sound, and you have to lay down a memory trace. It has to be personally relevant. And if you do that, we have seen over and over and over again that return on investment leads to a lift of sales in market. And I will leave you with a final thought. When we started doing this in 2006, there was a couple concerns, right? Oh, you've got all this technology. You're going to read people's minds. No, we don't read people's minds. Oh, you've got all this technology. You're going to find a buy button, and you're going to teach people how to push it. Nope, there's no buy button in the brain. We're not talking about erasing free will. But what has happened, and I think this is pretty impressive, is there's been a real shift. In 2006, when I started a company called Interscope that Nielson bought last year, we spent a lot of time educating about what emotions are and how things were. And there was this real sense in the marketplace that marketers were persuaders, they were authorities, and they had to use rational arguments to get their message across. And what we've seen, I think, over the last 10 years is a very positive shift. And that's away from authority to authenticity, away from persuaders to engagers, and away from rational to emotional. And I think that is a shift that has come from good research, and it has come from data, just like we heard with the Bernie Sanders campaign. Authenticity, emotion, and storytelling is really exactly right. That's what we see in our research, and hopefully you learned a little bit of something about engagement today, and I thank you for your attention.